Welcome to the Martinus Cosmology Podcast. My name is Mary McGovern and I'm your host for today. And I'm very happy to welcome once again Jens Christian Hermansen to our podcast. Welcome, Jens Christian.
Thank you so much, Mary. It's nice to be here again.
And Jens Christian, you gave a lecture this summer at the Martinus Center on facing death. So we're going to talk about death today. I thought it would be an interesting subject for people.
Yes, it's the last 2, 3, or 4 months. I've done some. I've read some books about death. I've given a lecture at the Martinus Center in Clint about facing death, as you said. And in July I visited a Dutch scientist that's done some research on the phenomenon of near-death experiences, Pim van Lommel. So I've been occupied quite a lot with death, or the phenomenon of death, the last 3 or 4 months. I've also reread what Martinus writes about death, and in many ways it's been a very nice experience, actually.
Yes.
And when you read what Martinus says about death, it's so optimistic.
So what effect has it had on you to read what Martinus has written about death?
Well, I sort of have my relationship with death and dying has changed during the last 10 or 20 years, and it's also changed during the last 3 or 4 months. What I sort of feel when I read Martinus is also the feeling that it's all right as it is. Dying isn't the end of life; it's just the continuity of it's the continuity of consciousness. When you die, what happens is that your consciousness takes on a different form. And when I visited Pim van Lommel in Holland, I also he's done this research on near-death experiences, and he's talked with hundreds of patients who've had a near-death experience, and he was so grateful in a way, and he had been personally affected by his long life studies on near-death experiences, and it's in a way it's transformed my own relationship to death. I sort of, when I think about death, I feel this curiosity. I mean, what is going to happen when I die? I'm curious, but I've also come to feel a sort of gratefulness for life.
Yeah. So do you feel you live life more fully, knowing that you're going to die at some point, that your consciousness is going to continue in another state?
I feel that it's been very sort of uplifting to learn about these people who've had near-death experiences, and it's been very inspiring, and it's also inspired me a lot to read what Martinus says about death, because I mean it makes sense. I think it's so logical, and it's filled with love. It makes and meaning and compassion. So it's definitely it's affected my own relationship with and changed my own sort of. Also, it's had some emotional impact on me. So I feel more at ease with dying than I did 10, 20 years ago, and even then I did half a year ago.
And even then what?
Then I did half a year ago.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So what is it about Martinus's view of death that appeals to you? What does Martinus say about death? What is death?
Well, according to Martinus, death is not something absolute. Death does not exist as an absolute entity. Death does not mark the sort of final end of our lives. Death is more is a change of consciousness. You could say it's a transformation of consciousness from one state to another state. So in that sense, death is a continuity of consciousness. When we leave our physical body, of course something dies. Our physical organism, it dies. But what Martinus says is that we have a physical body, but that's not all. We also have several spiritual bodies. And what happens when we die is that we leave our physical body, and then we wake up, in a sense, in a spiritual body. And waking up in a spiritual body is also waking up in the spiritual world, which then opens for us a completely different form of existence. So it's not the end of life. It's sort of dying is a cosmic sunrise, or you wake up in a different world, in a sense.
I believe Martinus uses the term the second birth. Like when you're born into this world, it's the first birth, so to speak. But when you die, that you're actually born into what he calls the spiritual worlds, and he calls that the second birth. So he calls it a birth process, which can be more or less difficult depending on what kind of thoughts you have in your head at the time of death.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, for some people, of course, and for many people, it's difficult. It's a challenging process to die, and it's very challenging and difficult to experience when people that you care for die. And of course the reason why it is like that is because we are afraid of death. Most people are afraid of death. They don't know what's going to happen when they die. Is death the end of everything? Do I completely disappear when I die? And what happens to all the people that I care for? Do they disappear as well?
And of course, I think the religions have very much contributed to people's fear of death. I've seen people in my own family die, and this fear of eternal damnation, a life in eternal hell, being burned alive for eternity after death if you haven't been good enough in this life, was such an overwhelming fear that it made it very difficult to die. It kind of, watching it was like it destroyed this process of death, really, which could have been a sort of easy letting go of the physical body, which was worn out. But instead it became this very fraught, anxious, hanging on until it was no longer possible. But I thought the religion had a big part to play in that.
Yeah, and it's sad in a way, because one of the things I've learned from Martinus, and one of the things I've learned from studying these near-death experiences, is that dying usually is a very, very beautiful thing. It's a fantastic experience, and people who have a near-death experience are very reluctant to return to their body again, because it's so amazing.
Yeah. So according to Martinus, there's nothing to fear in death.
No.
Nothing whatsoever. So what happens when we die? Where are we when we die? If we're not really dead, where are we? What are we doing?
What Martinus says is that the world that we live in, the physical world that we know, is not the only world that exists. There is a physical world, and we are very familiar with this world. It's the world that is studied by the natural sciences and so on. But what Martinus says is that there's a physical world, but there is also a spiritual world that exists alongside the physical world. And the spiritual world is a different kind of world, or actually there are several spiritual worlds, he says, in plural. And the spiritual world is a different kind of world than the physical world. It's there isn't the same sort of distinction between the inner and the outer that we experience in the physical world. So in the spiritual worlds, the sort of the outer world is constituted by your inner mental state. So what Martinus says, that when you die, you enter different zones, he says, and the first zone after dying is a sort of hell, or is a sort of purgatory, but it's a self-made hell. It's not all people that experience this, that have this kind of hell experience. It depends on how you die, and it depends on your mentality before you die. But if you're an atheist, if you're a materialist, if you have had a lot of problems in your life, if you have if you've struggled with bad consciousness, if you have difficulty in giving in letting go of your physical life, if you don't believe in an afterlife and so on, you can have this kind of hell experience when you die, where what you experience is sort of your own inner mental darkness, which constitutes your outer world. So you would experience, for example, dark clouds, bad smells, and so on, and you would attract other living beings that are on the same wavelength as you. It's a form of purgatory. It's a form of hell. It's not a real hell, but it's a form of self-made or self-created hell. It's a form of mental prison that exists not just in your mind, but also in the outer world. And that's due to the special character of the spiritual world, which is constituted by our consciousness.
This merging of the inner and the outer worlds, isn't that something that Ibn Alexander talked about when, after he recovered from his meningitis, he is an American neurosurgeon who had a near-death experience, and he talked about this merging of the inner and the outer worlds. This was part of his experience, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right.
Which was very close, I think, to Martinus' description that your own inner world constitutes the outer world in the spiritual world. So if you're in a very dark place when you die, for example, if you've committed suicide, you could be really depressed and really desperate. And of course, the biggest disappointment when you have committed suicide is you discover you're not actually dead, but your inner thoughts become your outer world. This is what you were saying, that you're on a wavelength with other beings who have those thoughts too.
Yeah. So the world that you find yourself in is actually is colored by your own mental state, and that's also you mentioned Ibn Alexander, this American neurosurgeon who had a very strong near-death experience, and he's written a book about that. And he had meningitis, and his brain was completely infected by bacteria, and he was in a coma for 7 days, and the doctors thought that he was going to die, and if he woke up, they thought that he would wake up with very difficult brain damage. But suddenly he woke up, and he reported that he had this very, very beautiful experience that completely changed his life, and the way that he describes this experience is very similar to what Martinus says, that in a sense this distinction between what's inside of me, my emotions and my thoughts and ideas, and what is outside of me, it doesn't exist in the spiritual world. What is inside, what we experience as being inside, is in a strange way also outside of us. So that's and of course we can relate to that to some extent from our life today. If I'm in a bad mood, if I'm depressed, then life is becomes darker in a way. But in the spiritual world, this is much more powerful, or
and very obvious.
Yeah, it's very, very obvious. That's right.
Of course, if you're thinking or feeling something negative here on the physical plane, you can to a certain extent hide it, and you can think, oh, it's good that he can't see what I'm thinking. But you, according to Martinus' view at least, you can't hide what you're thinking in the spiritual worlds. He talks about it being a world of states rather than distances. So your mental state becomes your outer experience, as far as I understand.
So you can, for example, I can travel to the moon physically, but I can also travel to the moon in my thoughts, simply by imagining that I travel to the moon, and then I'm there in a sense. So that gives us some kind of sense of how the spiritual world functions. So
when you die, you enter this state of purgatory where your inner thoughts become your outer world. What happens then?
Martinus describes our afterlife as a sort of travel that we undergo. So when I die, I enter into the sort of the first sphere after death. I enter into this purgatory. For some people, it doesn't take much time. For other people, it may take a lot of time, and then we continue to a different sphere, in a sense, to a kind of paradise zone, Martinus says. And this paradise zone is also a sort of self-made universe that we find ourselves in. So if you are a Christian, for example, you would find yourself in a kind of Christian paradise, as described in the Bible. Or if you're a Viking, you would find yourself in a completely different scenario. So the kind of paradise that you find yourself in depends on your own, on who you are. It depends on your background. It depends on your highest ideal, your highest ideals. What is the sort of the ideal form of living for you? That's sort of so this is also this paradise that you experience is also a sort of self-made paradise, Martinus says, and it may differ from individual to individual.
So just as our interests on the physical plane are very different, the areas we're attracted to in the spiritual world will be very different. So if we're interested in science, maybe we'll be attracted to being together with beings who are scientists, and if we're interested in solving the world situation, maybe we'll be attracted to the politicians on the spiritual plane, and if we're interested in art or music, there will be another area for that or something. Is that what you mean? Yes,
that's exactly what I mean. And in that sense, you can say that your life, your afterlife is a continuation of your life, or it's the way you live your life, your interests, your deepest interests, and your sort of highest ideals follow you in your afterlife, and it follows you in your afterlife.
Yeah, sometimes when you go to sleep, you can be struggling with some sort of problem, some question, and you go to sleep and you can wake up and you've got a new idea. You find, that's what I need to write, or that's a solution, and it's like you picked it up somewhere during sleep, like you found some inspiration while you were asleep. And is it a similar situation when you're dead, so to speak, that you can pick up inspiration there and be with like-minded people or beings, whatever you want to call them?
Yes, it is, and Martinus also describes actually sleeping is very similar to dying, and what happens when you fall asleep is, according to Martinus, is that your consciousness is also moved from your day consciousness is moved from your physical body to your spiritual bodies. So you visit the spiritual world overnight. That's exactly the same thing that happens when you die. You visit the spiritual worlds between lives or between incarnations.
So sleep and death are closely related.
Yeah, it's basically the same principle.
So there's nothing to fear about dying. I mean, we don't usually fear sleeping. Maybe some people do, but if they're very ill, they might be afraid of sleeping and not waking up again. But normally people are not afraid of sleeping. They rather look forward to it when they're tired.
Yeah, and it's when you. I remember when my grandfather died some years ago, and he was I think he was 92, and he was tired, and he had all sorts of difficulties with his body. It didn't function well anymore, and I could feel that he just wanted to die. He was tired, and his body didn't function anymore. And when he died, it just felt so natural. It felt like the right thing.
Yes.
And so I think it's a bit like falling asleep when you are tired.
Yeah, but people, of course, are very frightened of dying because they don't know what's going to happen. We have all this history of terrifying stories from the various religions, and of course we haven't been good enough in this life to deserve a life in paradise, at least according to Christianity and some other religions. So maybe there's some repair work to do there, and perhaps Martinus contributes to this, that he can remove some of this fear of death.
Definitely, that's my own experience, and I mean, if you take a look at science today and the so-called modern the modern scientific worldview, then what you find there is the idea that consciousness is, for example, the idea that consciousness is produced by our brain, and when you die, when your body and your brain die, then your consciousness also ceases to exist. So in a way, I think this fear of death is also due to this materialistic world picture. And what Martinus offers is an optimistic, non-materialistic world picture, according to which death does not exist, or death exists as transformation or change from one state to another state, but not as an absolute entity. When you die, what awaits you, according to Martinus, is not nothingness. It's a different form of life, and of course, these changes, these transformations, are very often difficult. So it's no surprise that it's difficult to die, and it's also difficult to grow up. It's difficult to become an adult when you're no longer young or a child. These changes, fundamental changes in your life from one state to another, are very often difficult for people.
Yeah, and Martinus talks very much about the power of prayer, and I think about this in two connections. One is the actual process of death can be very difficult if you're really ill, and you can maybe have a progressive illness, and it takes you a couple of years to die, where you're deteriorating very rapidly, and it can be a very difficult process to go through. And there he talks about finding support in prayer, but also you mentioned this purgatory, this process of purgatory after death. And I know he writes in several places that the way out of your own purgatory, this purgatory that you have created yourself, is to pray. Because he states there that then guardian angels will use suggestion here to sort of numb the negative sides of your consciousness, So if you're frightened, let's say you've been killed in a war, for example, you entered the spiritual worlds really suddenly. You weren't prepared for it. You maybe you're really disorientated. You don't know where you are. You don't know quite what's happened. So there could be some nursing to take place in this transition. So here he talks about guardian angels that can come and help, but you have to ask for help.
Yeah, that's and that's a fundamental point. I mean, no one can help you if you're not open to being to help, and that's when the transformation happens also in your own life. I mean, I think most people can relate to that in their own lives. I mean, the only way that you can only help someone if that person wants your help.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's impossible.
Yeah. Another thing that makes people very afraid of dying is that they can be afraid of losing a relationship that they're very happy about. For example, if you have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, or if you have a husband or a wife or children or very good friends, or even projects you're working on and not finished with. But anyway, if we take these relationships, maybe you feel you're not finished with this relationship and you don't want to die and leave this person, but, death happens. So what does Martinus say about that kind of situation?
It's right. I mean, if you die at a young age, for example, if you feel that you haven't sort of, you aren't ready to leave this life here on earth, then dying can be a very difficult process. If you die young, for example, if you die as an adult that are on the top of your career or whatever, you have a family, you have friends, you have children, and so on. Of course, that's a very very difficult situation. But the best thing you can do, also for your relatives, is to prepare yourself for dying in the right way.
How do you do that?
Well, yeah, Martinus says that, well, it's his wish with his analysis to show that it's a blessing to die when it happens in the right way. Then it's the entrance to a world of light. But of course you can experience that you leave this world too early, or you leave this world in a traffic accident or by suicide or whatever. But the best thing you can do is that you can send your good thoughts to your loved ones. You can work with accepting your fate, even though it might be a very difficult fate. You can work with your gratitude, and that was what I sort of that's what has affected me the most. I think how significant it is to work with one's with being grateful of all the different things I have experienced so far, with all the different relations I've been in, and that is perhaps that's one way of preparing your own death, developing a relationship of gratitude to the world, and also working on how you fall asleep and being better at falling asleep every night.
So how should one fall asleep if one is going to do it well?
In a calm mental state, perhaps think about something positive that has happened during the day, or reconcile oneself with difficult situations or disagreements, pray perhaps.
But let's say you're in a relationship and you feel you're really not finished with it. I mean, is death really the end of this relationship? If your consciousness continues after death, is it possible to meet your partner again in a coming life, in a future life?
Yeah, that's why Martinus's world picture is an optimistic world picture, because according to it, there is no such thing as death in an absolute sense. So if you leave your loved ones behind, you can meet them in the afterlife. You can receive them when they die, and they can meet you in the afterlife, and you can meet them again in a next life. Reincarnation is also an integrated part of Martinus's world picture. So, of course, people can be separated at some point. If one person dies, and in a relationship, if one person dies and the other lives on 10 or 20 years, but then they can meet again in the afterlife. So it's not the end. The end in any absolute sense.
I suppose then the same principle would hold true for people you have a problem with. Like if someone is constantly challenging you and really holding up a mirror to your negative sides, and you're constantly at odds with them, could you also meet them again until this kind of relationship is resolved, or what?
Yes, that's exactly that. It's of course that's the other part of the story. You could say that you will continue to meet people that you have some form of unfinished relationship or unfinished business with. Whether it's someone that you love and that you have strong feelings for, or the opposite.
You mentioned in your lecture something about research, and that some scientists state that reincarnation is highly improbable. And I wonder where that comes from. Is that based on some sort of research or knowledge, or is it based on some kind of unscientific belief or dogma, or where does that kind of opinion come from?
I think if you ask most scientists today what they think about reincarnation, or what they think about ideas about afterlife and ideas about God and so on, I think most scientists would say that, well, these things do not exist. It's correct that people believe in such a thing. Some people believe in such a thing as an afterlife or in reincarnation, but we know that it's just an illusion, or it's just ignorance, because there is no scientific proof of that. And so if you take a look at science today, most science is conducted within the framework of the materialistic world picture, and according to that world picture, everything that exists, it is what you can weigh and measure. It's what you can observe through your physical senses. So it doesn't make sense to talk about spiritual worlds and so on from that point of view. So I think most scientists would simply reject the idea of reincarnation or of a possible afterlife as simply being unscientific, being some form of religious idea that doesn't belong in science.
But isn't that an unscientific view? Because we see with, for example, this near-death experience research that people can have an ECG, a cardiogram, that's completely flat, the ultimate deadline, so to speak. There's no brain activity, no heart activity, and yet they can be brought to life, back to life, and they can tell you about what they experienced. So isn't it unscientific just to claim that reincarnation is not possible when there is the beginning of research, at least, into these experiences?
Yes, I agree with you. That's my opinion as well. It's very unscientific, but there is an element to science that is perhaps not as scientific as one should think. If you take, for example, this research area, this scientific the scientific research that's done on the phenomenon of near-death experiences, then that's a fine example of science that points beyond the materialistic world picture. But that form of science, that kind of science, is not really accepted within mainstream science today. But as I told in the beginning, some months ago, I visited a Dutch scientist, Pim van Lommel, who's done a lot of research on near-death experiences, and he's a cardiologist, and he's been occupied with near-death experiences for ages now. He's done a lot of interviews with patients who've had a near-death experience, and perhaps I should. A near-death experience is just to define that it's the reported memory of a special state of consciousness that usually happens during a critical medical situation, such as a cardiac arrest or drowning or coma, and then Pim van Lommel started to ask patients. To talk with patients who had survived a cardiac arrest. He started to ask them if they could remember something, if they had had any experiences during their cardiac arrest, and then to his surprise, about 20% or so had a near-death experience, which is this sort of enhanced or this overwhelming emotional experience, which is unlike anything that we know of here in the physical world.
Yeah, I once asked a group of patients, there were 5 heart patients, I asked them if they had had any kind of near-death experience. And it turned out that 4 out of 5 of them had. But they hadn't talked about it to anybody until I asked. So it was really interesting that it was so many. 4 out of 5 is a very high percentage, and they were very, very different types of people, and rather different experiences, but with a lot of things in common. So what kind of experiences are typical for a near-death experience?
Well, there are certain universal elements to near-death experiences, elements that people typically experience, regardless of gender and nationality and religious, non-religious beliefs. There are certain elements that are common to all near-death experiences, and for example, most experience strong emotions of peace and joy and bliss. It's a wonderful experience. Some have what is called an out-of-body experience. They can perceive or they can see. They fly above their body. Their consciousness is outside and above their body, and they can see what happens in the room. They can see the nurses, and they can hear the nurses talking, the doctors talking. They can hear what they talk about, and they can report what they have heard afterwards.
I've heard that that's true even if they are deaf in the physical life, that the deaf can hear and the blind can see.
Yes, that's right. Blind people experience that they can see, and they can describe what they have seen when they return to their body.
And of course, they're still blind when they return, aren't they?
They are still blind, yeah. They are still blind, so it's very difficult to explain, well, how can a blind person have these kind of experiences when they are blind? And deaf people experience that they can hear.
Yeah.
So that's sort of one element as well. Some also have what is called a tunnel experience. They experience that they traveled through a kind of tunnel, and at the end of this tunnel there is perhaps a strong light or a being of light that they meet, and from this being they experience unconditional love and accept. Some also experience unearthly surroundings, beautiful landscapes with fantastic colors and flowers. They perhaps hear beautiful musics, see cities and beautiful buildings. Some also meet deceased relatives, old friends and family members, and so on. Some also experience what is called a life review, where you relive your life in a moment. You experience the effects that your thoughts and actions have had on other people. You can feel other people's emotions and how they experienced you. So in that sense, you are sort of confronted with yourself and your own actions. So it's sort of, and people also describe how it's so difficult to return to one's body again. Perhaps you've been in a traffic accident and your bones are broken and so on, and you're in a lot of pain, and you come from this state where you felt free and you felt surrounded by love and compassion, this state of bliss, and then you come back in the physical body, which is which is an awful experience for many people.
But then it's my impression that this near-death experience, however difficult your life is, having been brought back to life, having been resuscitated, you might wake up in a terrible condition, in a wheelchair, and have all sorts of handicaps. But this near-death experience sort of lights up your life, at least for many people. Like it seems to change people permanently.
Yes, it completely changes people's lives. People that didn't believe in an afterlife before, people that were atheists and materialists, now become interested in spiritual things.
Yeah.
So it completely, and people become much more grateful for things in their life, for life as such. So it completely changes people's lives, and that's also a very difficult process for many people, because their partners and friends and colleagues, they can see, well, it's a different person that has come back.
Yeah.
Because this person has really changed so much.
But it's usually a very positive change.
It's a very positive change for yes, and but some people, a small amount of people, also has what in the literature is called a hell experience.
Yeah.
Which is sort of similar to this purgatory that we talked about, where they experience being in an awful place with high noises and terrible smells, and with strange creatures, and they it's a very, very unpleasant place to be in, and if you wake up from that place and you found yourself in your body, then your near-death experience hasn't been a very positive one. It's been an awful one, and people with this hell experience, with these that have had these hell experiences, they often develop a fear of death. Okay,
but it doesn't seem as if that's what happens most of the time.
No, it's just it's a few it's a few percentage, but people are very reluctant to talk about it.
Yeah, I can understand that. So perhaps one could conclude from all of these stories, and there are hundreds, if not thousands of them, of near-death experiences, that consciousness survives the death of the physical body.
Yes, I mean that's what these researchers and scientists working with this conclude, that when you die, it's the end of your physical body, but it's not the end of your consciousness. And it's interesting, because if you once again take a look at this materialistic worldview, then according to this worldview, then consciousness is a product of physical processes in your brain. But what happens during a cardiac arrest, for example, is that your heart and your brain activity stops. You're clinically dead, but you still have these experiences, and you can have these out-of-body experiences where you can describe what happens in the room, where you can describe what is being said and what you hear. You can describe what happens in other rooms and so on, what was in a particular drawer and so on. It's very difficult to explain that from a materialistic point of view, because if there is no brain activity, then how can you have these experiences? So what this research suggests is that consciousness is not a product of physical brain activity, that consciousness can continue after the physical body dies, that there is a continuity of consciousness after death, and that is also Martinus's claim.
I know he describes the brain as a kind of aerial or antenna for the consciousness, and not the it's not the consciousness itself.
No, it's the our consciousness is not the product of the brain. The brain is merely an antenna or aerial system. It doesn't produce consciousness. It's something secondary to consciousness. It's just an instrument or a tool.
Death doesn't seem so bad then. It's almost something to look forward to. But of course, none of us wants to leave this earth too early, prematurely. We would like to finish what we're doing, and unless, of course, we're very depressed and we'd like to get it all over and done with. But then there's something to work on.
Yeah, that's right.
So I know Martinus said in a lecture, he looked out over the lecture hall and he said, everybody here, everyone in the audience has committed suicide at some point in their eternal past. Which was a very strong statement. And people can get into a very dark place where they feel that that's the way out. But as I said earlier, it can be a great disappointment that the first thing you experience after that kind of event is that you're not actually dead. So, and he says in that connection that you will come back, you will reincarnate, and you will solve whatever issue it is you're dealing with until you can create a completely happy life for yourself. Anyway, seems like death is nothing to fear. Is there anything you would like to add?
Well, perhaps just one thing. It's Martinus says that what he what he writes about death is based on his own experiences. So it's not. It's for him. It's not just a. It's not just a theory. It's something that is more than real in a sense. And it's interesting when you talk to patients that have had a near-death experience. What they say is that the experiences that they've had are more real than real. They are more real than the physical experiences that we have.
Yeah.
So in a sense, what we experience the physical reality as the reality. But what Martinus says and what these people who've had near-death experiences say is that, well, the spiritual world is more real in a sense than the physical world.
Interesting. So we have a very real life ahead of us beyond the grave. Thank you very much, Jens Christian Hermansen, for joining the Martinus Cosmology podcast. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. It's been a pleasure.